This was the scene in Vancouver tonight. Hundreds of people gathering at Science World in protest of a multi-billion-dollar pipeline purchase by the federal government. Good evening. Canada is getting into the pipeline business. The federal government now owns the Trans Mountain Pipeline. Justin Trudeau's Liberals announcing the deal today, intended to make sure the project goes ahead on schedule. CTV's Chandler Grieve begins our coverage tonight.
Get that pipeline built.
For months he's been saying it, and now his government is owning it literally.
The federal government has reached an agreement with Kinder Morgan to purchase the existing Trans Mountain Pipeline and the infrastructure related to the Trans Mountain expansion project.
2 days before Kinder Morgan's May 31st deadline, the feds have stepped in by putting up $4.5 billion to take over ownership of the Trans Mountain Pipeline.
We've agreed to a fair price for our shareholders, and we've found a way forward for this national interest project.
Opponents to the project calling the decision to put taxpayers on the hook reckless and a disaster.
This will go down as an epic financial, economic boondoggle.
Trudeau boxed himself into a corner, and what he does to get out of that corner is he uses your money, your money, your money, and my money to backstop a multinational corporation who are now laughing as they go to the bank.
A similar sentiment echoed from protesters today outside the now federally owned Burnaby terminal.
This changes nothing. In fact, it just increases the work we have to do.
The much-debated pipeline that will triple the amount of oil flowing to BC's coast is currently the center of a court reference case filed by the BC government. This morning, BC's premier took a call from the Prime Minister and told Trudeau the court case stands despite the change in ownership.
I'm concerned that there could be catastrophic consequences of a diluted bitumen spill in British Columbia, regardless of the owner of the pipeline, regardless of the owner of the rail cars.
But certainly some folks would suggest that their reference case will have less relevance than it did before today's announcement.
The $4.5 billion price tag will climb once construction continues on the pipeline. The federal government is hoping to find a private buyer that will eventually take over the project. Chandler Grieve, CTV News, Victoria.
As much as the Prime Minister and Alberta would like to see this project through to completion, there is a lot of energy standing in its way, particularly here in BC. CTV's Melanie Nagy has the reaction.
Several First Nations in BC say the possibility of a catastrophic tanker spill makes the pipeline too risky, a sentiment shared by environmental groups.
400 super tankers that this project would bring in endangers the entire West Coast coastline, and I think that you're going to see that opposition grow.
Are you with me? But there's also huge support for the pipeline, with several rallies popping up just last week.
It amounts to 1 tanker per day.
Ernie Cray, chief of the Chiem First Nation, applauds the purchase, and he says his community wants to invest.
We take out a stake in it, and guess what? 43 other First Nations along the pipeline route would very likely do the same.
Those who want the pipeline built believe it will create jobs and boost the energy industry. But with all the potential benefits, there are still concerns that Canadians are footing the bill.
It's really a debacle when you think about it. This was a really good private sector project, and now all the risk is being borne by taxpayers.
As you can see behind me, the protests continue, but so too do the legal hurdles. More than a dozen challenges are still before the court. Melanie Nagy, CTV News, Vancouver.
A major development to tell you about this morning concerning the controversial Trans Mountain Pipeline. The federal government has agreed to buy it from Kinder Morgan.
CTV's Ben Milger has been following this breaking news for us. Ben, how much is this going to cost?
Carrie, Canadian taxpayers now own this project at a cost of $4.5 billion for the existing pipeline and the controversial expansion. Ottawa will go ahead with construction, which it says it wants to wrap up this week to get in front of the summer building season. The feds are also still seeking other investors, but say until this point, the focus was on getting this deal done, and they have not had serious discussions with buyers. Of course, for anyone who does buy the project, it also comes with protesters who have promised to block construction.
We will recognize that Canadians have a right to express their point of view in a legal fashion, and that will continue to be an important part of our democracy.
So, Ben, the feds are in for $4.5 billion already. What about construction costs?
That's another multi-billion-dollar question, and one the finance minister refused to give straight answers to at this morning's press conference. As a starting point, though, Kinder Morgan pegged construction costs at between $200 and $300 million per month. John Horgan has called a news conference for later this morning, and we'll have his reaction to this news on CTV News at noon. Carrie?
All right, thank you, Ben.
Happening right now, Kinder Morgan opponents rallying in Vancouver, voicing their opposition to the federal government's plan to buy the Trans Mountain Pipeline project. Good evening and thanks for joining us. Chris is off tonight. The federal Liberals making the announcement today, stating the goal is to ensure the controversial expansion is built. The cost? $4.5 billion. That's for current infrastructure. But Canadians could also be forking out billions more to actually construct the project. The price tag earlier tabled by Kinder Morgan, about $7.4 billion.
A large group gathered outside Science World in Vancouver last night to voice their opposition. Ottawa is spending $4.5 billion to buy the existing pipeline and Kinder Morgan's core assets to get construction moving once again. Federal Finance Minister Bill Morneau insists taxpayers won't be on the hook for the total construction cost, estimated at $7.4 billion, saying the project will be sold down the road at a profit. Protesters call it a major mistake.
Absolutely, I just couldn't believe this was happening in Canada. I'm appalled. I can't find words to express my anger.
I mean, with $4.5 billion, we couldn't find better things to do with that money. There's people homeless. We should be making investments in the future. The oil industry is the past. Sunset industry.
People's concerns are being railroaded over, and I think there are some bullies in the playground, maybe. I would just like to stand here to make sure that our voices are heard.
Aaron MacArthur has more on today's announcement and what the plan is going forward.
Get that pipeline built.
With Kinder Morgan's deadline about to expire, the federal government was left with little choice. Let Trans Mountain disintegrate or put billions of taxpayer dollars on the line. The federal government has promised $4.5 billion for the existing pipeline and terminal facility in Burnaby, and then at minimum $7.4 billion to build nearly 1,000 kilometers of new pipeline. But the federal government has no intention of keeping this asset.
Our view is long-term that this project should be in the private sector. It has value, commercial value, for a private owner.
Plan A sees the Trudeau government start construction and then work with Kinder Morgan to find a new buyer by August. If that doesn't happen, Plan B sees the government finance the entire project and then try to pawn it off down the road. Now, the new owners of a pipeline, it remains to be seen how long the taxpayers of Canada will be on the hook for this energy project. Aaron MacArthur, Global News.
All right, Tanya Beja joins us now with more on the reaction here in BC. Tanya, protest groups not wasting any time making their position known on this.
That's right, Sophie. There are several hundred people gathered here at Creekside Park. They are directing their anger at the Prime Minister, saying they don't want this pipeline built. Trans Mountain Pipeline may be getting a new owner, but opponents say threats to the environment haven't changed.
The risks of this pipeline and tankers project are too great to the coast, to our communities, to our climate. The opposition is still strong. There's still many legal challenges.
The city of Burnaby is leading some of those battles, challenging the consultation process, Kinder Morgan's chosen route, and obligation to comply with local bylaws. Under federal ownership, Canadian taxpayers will foot the legal bills, but that doesn't sway Mayor Derek Corrigan.
The mask has been pulled off, and we see who's behind the mask now is actually the federal government. It won't change the court proceedings as far as I'm concerned.
You could be arrested for not leaving.
He's hopeful Burnaby will no longer be on the hook for RCMP costs.
It is now all federal, and they can be responsible for looking after the policing that's required as the protests increase exponentially.
Even British Columbians who want a pipeline built say the government is going about it the wrong way.
Yesterday, we had a private company that was more than willing to foot this entire bill.
lock, stock and barrel. They were going to pay for it, and tens of thousands of jobs were going to result because of it. Today, we're in this for more than $11 billion of taxpayers' money.
Reaction among First Nations communities is divided.
The benefits will flow to this community, and I dare say 42 other communities in Alberta and British Columbia, First Nations community, will be huge and be very meaningful to all of those communities.
The people are saying no, and the federal government is not listening, and they're still offering package deals which are a short trade-off to what is really at stake here.
This is likely the first of many protests aimed at the federal government. The pipeline may get a new owner, but it will face the same battles. Sophie, back to you.
I'm sure. All right, Tanya Beja for us in Vancouver.
Now, local politicians are weighing in as well, including Burnaby South MP and Vancouver mayoral candidate Kennedy Stewart, who joins us from Vancouver. Kennedy, thank you very much for coming on the show. You were arrested for protesting pipelines, so I have an idea of where you stand. Your thoughts on today's announcement?
Well, I think Canadians really have to know what they bought into here. The original pipeline was built in 1953 and it leaks like a sieve. It's leaked 40,000 barrels since it was built, including major spills in Burnaby and along the rest of the route. It is in very bad repair and in fact is in illegal areas in a lot of cases, running smack through the middle of First Nations reserves and through highly populated residential communities. They're going to have to sink hundreds of millions of dollars into the old pipeline in order to get it up to snuff, let alone the new pipeline. So this project could be $15–20 billion of taxpayers' money. It is a bad idea.
Bad idea. Okay, so 40,000 barrels, that's over a 60-year time period. Now, a lot of people will say that oil sort of stirs the drink of the Canadian economy. Ottawa, Alberta, they're both saying that we're losing millions by the day by not building this pipeline, billions if it doesn't get built at all. What do you say to that?
Well, I think that, you know, they have their kind of future projections, but I'm talking about the reality right now. I've walked this pipeline route, I've gone on the reserves, I've gone in the communities in Burnaby and across the Lower Mainland. The original route, the original pipeline is literally a few meters away from people's homes, which is not legal. So I think the company is, the government has really pulled a, you know, they've got a huge white elephant here, and the Kinder Morgan, like usual, is making off like bandits, laughing all the way back to Texas.
Interesting. I mean, your premier, our premier, Premier Horgan, there's some are saying that this is giving him an out. This situation now gives him an out on this whole decision, this whole moving forward. Yeah, I know there's court decisions that still hang in the balance, but some are saying it does give him an out. What do you want the premier to do right now?
I think the Premier's been doing the thing he should be doing, is protecting British Columbians. Look, this thing, so we have some kind of loose agreements with First Nations. There's dozens of them across the pipeline route. I think if I was them, I'd be renegotiating these agreements, because it not only affects the new pipeline, it's the old pipeline too, which again, I believe goes through 15 reserves and at least 80 First Nations territories. So I think that the government has really stepped in it today. I mean, if the biggest pipeline company in the world can't make this work, why would the government make it work? And they're risking billions, I would say 15 to 20 billion when this price is over. Who's going to buy that from them? This is a desperate move, and really, I'm still going to do everything I can to stop it.
Yeah, and I think that that's something that a lot of people will continue to protest and try and stop it. As far as British Columbia is concerned, I mean, there's a lot of people who were pro-pipeline, a lot of people that are anti-pipeline, but people who are kind of 50-50 on the issue. What do you think they are feeling about this announcement, and where did they stand after this?
Well, I think, sure, maybe the province is split half and half on the new pipeline, but ask them how they feel about spending $15 to $20 billion in taxpayers' money to buy this infrastructure when they could be putting it into housing or healthcare. I mean, we haven't had any housing units built here in the city of Vancouver by the federal government, but yet they can give a pipeline company $4.5 billion for a rickety old thing built in the 1950s. Like, this is very poor judgment, and it shows what their priorities are. Their priorities are a Texas oil giant versus their own people, and I think it's a shame, and Trudeau really has stepped in it here.
Interesting to get your take on it. Thank you very much. Burnaby South MP, Vancouver mayoral candidate Kennedy Stewart, thank you for your time, sir.
Canada will work with investors to transfer the project and related assets to a new owner or owners in a way that ensures that the project's construction and operation will proceed in a manner that protects the public interest.
The federal government wants to avoid becoming a pipeline owner and will partner with Kinder Morgan over the next 8 weeks to find a buyer for the pipeline. Construction costs are not included in the $4.5 billion price tag. Environmental activists are questioning the decision.
It's completely outrageous that Trudeau would be using public funds to bail out a multinational corporation when we could be creating more jobs by investing in a clean energy economy instead. Kinder Morgan knows this is a risky investment. That's why they want it out. Their shareholders are laughing their way to the bank, and meanwhile Canadian taxpayers have been saddled with a terrible investment that violates Indigenous rights, threatens our coast and our climate, and is going to cost billions more to be completed.
Justin Trudeau put all his personal political capital into this project. At the end of the day, it was becoming very apparent to a number of us observers that big money was going to be involved here. It was going to have to come from the Canadian taxpayers and from the Trudeau government. So no surprise here.
The announcement this morning by Finance Minister Bill Morneau and reaction to it.
The audacity of the member opposite to talk about not getting a pipeline to market, which is what he and his party were unable to do, when we have stepped forward and said that we are going to take the decision to put a project in the national interest forward so that we can create the economic advantage that we're seeking. The economic advantage for Canada with $15 billion of advantage to our economy, 15,000 jobs. We, Mr. Speaker, are moving forward in the national interest for Canadians.
The federal government has made a choice, a decision that was motivated by the decisions of a private company who gave a deadline not to me, not to the people of British Columbia, but to someone they characterized as stakeholders. The federal government has responded, and that's their business.
Do you believe that you've cost taxpayers $4.5 billion?
I made no such undertaking of tax dollars, quite the contrary. The accountability for those decisions should rest with the people who made them, and that's the federal government and, by inference, the government of Alberta.
Joining us live for some analysis are Legislative Bureau Chief Keith Baldry in Victoria and CKNW's Charles Adler in Vancouver. First of all, Keith, this morning's announcement came as a bit of a surprise to many. Other than a looming deadline, what's your take on why this move?
Well, I think it speaks a couple of things. First of all, I think it was becoming clear Kinder Morgan was just not interested in pursuing this project. The fact they set that deadline of May 31st was the first sign that they were prepared to walk away from this, because I think their excuse was that there was too much political delay. Well, there's no evidence there's any less politically driven delay, particularly from BC's perspective, since that deadline was imposed. So I think it was started to form the basis of an exit strategy for Kinder Morgan. But Justin Trudeau has gone all in on this pipeline. He has staked his entire political capital on this thing being built. If it's not built, he suffers enormously. So Kinder Morgan basically stared down Ottawa here. Ottawa had no choice, really, at the end of the day, to go all in on this with potentially tax dollars. So they're going to be exposing the taxpayers to at least $4.5 billion, but the cost will be significantly more than that, Colleen, because 4.5 gets you the existing pipeline, the terminal, and some of the infrastructure. But the expansion itself is another $7 billion or so, and there's some ongoing expenses attached with that as well. There's also the spill response strategy, $1.5 billion there. So the costs will mount here, but Trudeau government, I think, is in a desperate situation. They had to do what needed to be done to get this thing built, and that meant exposing the taxpayers to significant financial risk.
Charles, I'm sure you remember something called the Hibernia oil fields, a deal that was struck in 1993, which was very similar to what's going on now, where the federal government purchased it with the intent to sell. We still own it.
Of course we still own it. Look, I mean, just from and I don't want to make an apology for being part of the private sector, but I'm a private sector person, and this is how private sector people see something. Kinder Morgan saw a chump in Trudeau and Morneau, because Trudeau and Morneau were motivated buyers. They had basically telegraphed and gone beyond telegraphed that they were willing to buy this thing. So they buy a 65-year-old pipe, which is worth approximately $3.5 billion, and they pay another $1 billion, okay, because they're motivated buyers, and that hurts their position. So Kinder Morgan down in Texas loves that particular position. Now, the same bunch that is overpaying by $1 billion for old pipe is telling people, investors, anybody around the world, that they're willing to sell this as soon as possible. So the motivated buyer that's paying $1 billion penalty is now a motivated seller, which means they'll pay a penalty on the other side. They're going to buy high and possibly sell cheap. So from a private sector perspective, once again, this thing looks like a real loser.
This is a huge political risk for the Trudeau government and an economic risk for Canadian taxpayers. Kinder Morgan played by all the rules and wasn't certain it could get this project built. So why should we believe the federal government will now succeed?
Now the Prime Minister is telling Canadian taxpayers that they are going to have to pay for his mistakes. He is writing a check for $4.5 billion for an existing pipeline. Not a single centimeter of new pipeline will be built with this bill to the taxpayer. It is going to a Texas-based company who is taking that money out of Canada. Why is it that when Liberals are in power, taxpayers have to pay $4.5 billion for something they could have got for free?
Right Honourable Prime Minister. Speaker, the Conservatives tried for 10 years to get our resources to markets other than the United States, and they failed. And now that we're actually securing access to new markets, securing Canadian jobs, securing Albertan jobs, their ideology is getting in the way. So I remind them, Mr. Speaker, that the great Peter Lougheed knew that public investment in resource development is essential to move forward as a country. That's exactly what we're doing for Alberta and for Canadians, Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister is trying to characterize the belief that when a private sector company wants to use shareholders' money to build a pipeline, that is somehow rigid ideology. Well, Mr. Speaker, when a Texas-based company wants to bring $4.5 billion of investment into Canada, Conservatives will support that investment and not ask taxpayers to pay for his mistakes.
Right Honourable Prime Minister. That was integral in Rachel Notley's approach. That is what they have done. That is indeed what we have done to demonstrate the economy and environment go together. Honourable Member for Skeena-Baltry Valley.
I must have missed the part where she said we should nationalize a 65-year-old pipeline with $4.5 billion of Canadians' money. Liberals do know it's not legal to smoke weed until August, right? Because this idea makes no sense at all. When he was asked about why he bailed out a Texas oil company, this is what the Prime Minister said. This is what he said. It was too risky for a commercial entity to take on. What? If it's too risky for an oil pipeline company to build an oil pipeline, why is it okay for the Canadian public to pick up all of that risk? Liberals have to learn one thing and one thing finally, that bailing out Texas oil companies is no way.
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Today's announcement by the federal government does not reduce the risk of a diluted bitumen spill and the impact that would have on BC's economy and its environment. And it does not change the course that the government of British Columbia has been on since we were sworn in July of 2017. I will continue to do my best to protect BC's interest by ensuring that our coast, our water, and our land is kept pristine so that our economy can continue to grow. And I will continue to work for the people of British Columbia with the full force of my efforts within the courts and within the rule of law. I believe that it's appropriate for us to continue down that road despite the decisions by the federal government today.
Burnaby South MP Kennedy Stewart, who pleaded guilty to criminal contempt after being arrested protesting Kinder Morgan, says taxpayers are getting ripped off.
They're going to have to sink hundreds of millions of dollars into the old pipeline in order to get it up to snuff, let alone the new pipeline. So this project could be $15–20 billion of taxpayers' money. It is a bad idea.
A great idea, says the president of Kinder Morgan, whose company's stock surged in the morning.